There's this really fascinating documentary series that came out in the 60s called the Up series that started in the UK, where they got a bunch of 7-year-olds from different parts of the country, from different social backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, different family backgrounds. Some people lived in the city, some people lived in the country, and what they did was they interviewed them when they were 7 years old and asked them a couple of questions about what they thought about life, what they thought about where they would be going in the future, what they thought about the country, what they thought about just meaning in general and all this stuff. And they asked them a bunch of these questions, and what they did was in 7 years they would revisit them, and the next series was called the next film was called 14 Up, and then after that was 21 Up. And so the idea was that every 7 years they would revisit these these like a dozen or so children that they first interviewed, and tried to map out where their lives eventually turned out and went, depending on the theory behind the whole show is that wherever you're from, like the initial circumstances you're in when you're perhaps 7 years old, those things shape you for who you are and who you end up becoming in the future. And those things are perhaps things you don't necessarily control, but those things have such a strong influence on where your life eventually goes. That's kind of the theory behind the show, but behind the documentary series, I mean. But I realized recently that they've replicated this series in different countries all around the world, and last night I watched two separate documentary films, the Japanese version of this, which I saw 7 Up and 14 Up, and it is very fascinating because because documentaries were shot in the 90s. The first one came out in 1992, and for those who are unfamiliar with Japanese history or whatever, in the early 90s, Japan suffered what many people call, well, I guess in economics you call it a stagnation, or generally that just means that there's very very slow economic growth in the early 90s, and it has persisted all throughout into the 2000s. And what they sometimes dub them, as they call them, the Japanese, they call them like the lost generation of sorts. There's people who grew up in this 90s 2000s Japan that they just suffered a lot of economic problems and all these different things. And it's interesting because this show, I don't know if it was on purpose, but it to some extent it inadvertently looks at what it's like to live in Japan in the 90s during this economic stagnation, and what it's like for the children, the younger generation, and how these things shape their perspectives on the world and shape their lives and all this stuff. So one of the first few things you notice from watching these two documentaries, at least, what you know, for me at least, what I noticed was that there was a big issue that the series seems to really be focusing on is the idea of the fractured family, right? So there is this because of cultural because of cultural expectations as well as the economic situation. Many men in the household, many of the fathers, they are forced to go into these very long jobs with very very long hours in order to be able to pay the rent, to keep their family sustained to some degree. And what in the process of all these long hours, they never end up being able to have they never end up being a presence in the life of the children. So a couple of the kids, for example, in the show, they were asking something like, do you miss your father? Or how often do you see your father? And they'll say something like, well, sometimes we or how often do you have dinner with your father? And then they'll say something like, sometimes once a week, sometimes on Sundays, but other times they're busy on Sundays because they have to entertain clients or something, and or in the perspective of the child, it's like they're playing golf on Sundays. So some of them say like, oh, sometimes we eat dinner with my dad once a week. Sometimes it doesn't even happen once a week, but you can tell that there's something very, and it even carries over into in the 14 Up, 7 years later, when these kids are 14 in their teenager years. You can tell that these people, there's some kind of, I don't want to say resentment for their father figures, but then there's a sense in which they feel very disconnected from the generation above them because of this feeling perhaps of abandonment, maybe to some degree, or just this feeling that they haven't been a strong fixture in their lives, so they don't necessarily have a pathway a figure to which they look up to that they want to replicate, because they just don't see their fathers very often. And this is for people specifically in the city. These are like city children problems. The people in the more provincial areas of Japan, the ones who are in the show, I don't remember the specific cities, but for them, many of them seem to have family businesses, or at least situations in which there is some level of succession with their future, where so for example, their father is the head of a troop of some sort, or their grandmother is the head of like a captain of some ship where they catch fish or something or whatever. Like there is some kind of hierarchy in their family life where they're well, as 7-year-olds they look up to their matriarchs or patriarchs, and they think like, well, okay, this is what I want to be when I grow up. This is my future. One of them, a kid, for example, lives on a farm, and when he's 7 years old, he says, you know, I want to be like my dad. I want to grow rice. That is what I want to do, because if you eat rice, I want to eat rice so I can be healthy enough so I can work and make rice again. It's very interesting how they're already so aware of these cyclical structures that they seem to be in the process of going into. That, you know, it's interesting for me at least. And a lot of those people in the more provincial areas have a, perhaps I don't want to say a healthier sense, but they have like a more steady perspective of what they want to be on in the future based on the fathers that brought them up, or perhaps for some of their mothers or their grandmothers. However, for those kids, it seems very interesting, but not even. I don't know if it's necessarily. It's probably coincidental, but in the series of sorts, the kids who felt that they wanted to replicate the pathway that their parents seemed to have put up for them back when they were 7, when they were 14, they had no interest anymore. They didn't want to become like their parents. They realized, one girl, for example, says something like, I don't want to do that anymore because I realize I've been seeing my dad. It just looks like it's a lot of hard work, and it's tiring, and it seems like you take too much effort and you don't get any sleep or something like it. Something to that extent. You know, there's this feeling in which, well, yeah, after the last how many years of watching my parents do this stuff, they don't seem that happy maybe, and I don't want to do that. So it's very interesting that in both cases there is a sense of like a disconnect with your parents and disconnect with prospects and something like that. And when they're 14, there's such a strong focus for them in Japanese culture. It seems to have very high grades in order to get into specific high quality top universities. Not even universities, but while they're 14, they think of getting into good high schools. So a lot of their lives is consumed by constant studying, night after night, lack of sleep. They want to get into these high schools so they can get in, and there's already some sad stories of people who missed out on their top choice and all this stuff. And again, the backdrop behind all of these lives is that during the 90s there was such a big economic stagnation that the reason why their parents are so focused on work and working so hard that they don't have time for their children is specifically because, while it may be cultural as well, but it's also exacerbated by the economic situation in Japan at the time. So, for example, one of the kids, he wanted to be like his father. He wanted to be he wanted to make pots. He wanted to be a potter, like his father, who seemed, based on some of the clips, who seemed like a very creative and, you know, worthwhile profession to some degree if you like that kind of thing. And when he was a kid, he loved it. But when he turned 14, by the time he turned 14, the company of his father making pottery, all the workers that he was with lost their jobs. It was only him now. It became a single enterprise as opposed to some grander business. And he was alone and still making pots, but without any other company anymore. So for him, he looked at that profession saying, you know, I don't know if I can do that anymore because it doesn't seem like it will, like it's just a different situation. And it's just very interesting to see this perspective from these Japanese kids in the 90s, and how much they seem to have, how even though they may not necessarily be aware of the economic situation of what exactly is driving this shift in thinking, or shift in all this stuff, they are definitely, it seems like you can see that they are experiencing a lot of the detrimental effects of societal wise into their ways of thinking about the world, where they just feel like when you're pushed against the wall, it becomes, you know, I have to get into this good school. If I don't get into this good school, I'm not going to get any good job. And if I don't get a good job, I will be homeless, and and my family will not only not care, will not be able to be supported by me, but I will not be able to support anyone else, and I will be useless to society. It's a lot of pressure for children, and I'm sure this is the same thing, similar thing you get in the United States, but then because of the economic situation in Japan at the time, it seemed more exacerbated, I think. Oh, and one more thing, with regard to that whole family, that whole parentlessness, or the single parentlessness, one of the things that was very interesting that I found out from watching this thing was that apparently, so there was a couple of these kids who were 7 who were living in these homes. It looked like orphanages, but then the difference was that it wasn't actually, their parents weren't dead. Their parents were just divorced. Apparently in Japan, in the 90s at least, there was such a strong cultural stigma for being a single parent, that if you were to divorce with your spouse, you'd rather put your kid into a home as opposed to taking care of them on your own and be seen as a single parent. So there was these homes. There was a home in the shot in the documentary where there's this kid who's from there, who is there only because his parents split up and he doesn't see his parents often anymore. But it's the thing. I think it's even worse than being an orphan. You know, the idea that your parents are alive and they have the capacity to take care of you, but they just won't because they're embarrassed of you. What are embarrassed of the situation they're in? It's kind of a shitty thing to be in. That's kind of sucks. But anyway, I'm very looking forward to seeing more of the show and seeing how they progress into aughts. It's a very fast. It's one of my favorite documentary series, the Up series in the UK. I made a video here before about 28 Up, which I'm a big fan of as well. And it's so fascinating because I was looking more at where else it was done, and they have one in South Africa, which they started in early 90s as well. And they're all on YouTube. I saw bits of the first one, and it starts in apartheid South Africa. So like the very first episode, I skipped to a different part, and I saw that kid was saying that he wants. There's still apartheid, so a black kid saying he wants to live with the whites, and it's fascinating. I don't know if a lot of it is on purpose, but then again, the timing of this stuff. Like one of them was in Germany, I think, just around the time of the reunification of East Germany and West Germany. Like what's like the timing of this stuff is amazing. Another one was in Russia, right at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they were able to track these kids. So it's very fascinating. And even if you think about like Seven Up in America, for example, there's a version of it in America, or I guess Seven Up New Generation. There's one about that started in 2000. And I guess if you watch that one with a newer generation of kids who are around my age, I guess this is about the generation who lived through 9/11, right? So there are all these very fascinating. It feels like anthropological ways to look at human civilizations in different countries and see how people think about the world and how they were able to grapple with situations that were completely out of their control. And I think it's very fascinating. And these are kinds of the things I'm very interested in terms of documentaries. So 7 Up, 14 Up, 7 Up Japan, 14 Up Japan. I'm a big fan of these, and I find them so fascinating. And I think if you have any interest in Japan culture or Japanese people or just humanity in general, check this out because it is very eye-opening. And yeah, that's all I have to say. It's very good.